Okay, in the second part of the video, we will look at how Americans reacted to this new wealth and its inequality, its unequal accumulation. One philosophy that a lot of Americans use to uh, accept this unequal accumulation of wealth was to believe in basically what we would call free market economics, or a lot of times another term that's used for it is laissez-faire economics. So if you ever hear that term, basically means the same thing. Laissez-faire is just a French phrase that means let it do its thing. So in other words, the idea is to let individuals buy and sell products and services with a minimal amount of government regulation, taxation, subsidies, or other interference. Uh, Minimal amount of interference from unions as well. Basically, don't have any sort of collective institution that interferes with individuals signing voluntary contracts with each other. That's the idea of free market economics. Usually, the supporters of this idea make an exception for the taxation needed to fund the branches of the government that serve to enforce contracts and protect private property from being taken involuntarily by others. So they're okay with tax money being used for the police, the court system, and the military. But other things, a really staunch free market economist would say that the government should not be using tax money on anything else, really. Um, the logic behind free market economics was most famously explained by Adam Smith in his 1776 book, Wealth of Nations. One concept that Adam Smith introduced was the invisible hand. This was a theory for how the private pursuit of profit could paradoxically benefit the public, benefit society as a whole. People trying to maximize their own interests would somehow benefit everyone. Seems paradoxical, right? His idea was also a theory for how the economy regulated itself without the need for conscious understanding of the economy or control over it by any one person or group of people, such as the government. And to help explain this concept of the invisible hand, I want you to consider the following scenario. All right, imagine a terrorist group hatches a plot to somehow bomb every single factory in the world that manufactures pain-relieving drugs like aspirin. So very quickly, the world starts to face shortages of these essential drugs. Mwahaha, it seems to be working, right, for the terrorists. And at first, you can imagine desperate people around the world will be willing to pay higher and higher prices in order to bid against each other for the limited supply of aspirin pills left. Imagine that every time supermarkets check their medicine aisles, they find that their very small amount of aspirin pills that they have in stock to sell have sold out. So they keep increasing the price just to see how much consumers and hospitals will be willing to pay for these aspirin pills. Every time they get a little bit of shipment in of new, pills from somewhere, maybe there's just a small amount of them being produced now. So pretty soon you can imagine that aspirin pills in this scenario might be selling for $1,000 per pill, and only the wealthy will be able to afford to take aspirin. I would imagine that people would be outraged, right? Some might even call on the government to sign a law controlling the price of aspirin. Under this law, any store caught selling aspirin for more than its old customary price of, let's say, 10 cents per pill will be fined, with tougher penalties if stores repeatedly ignore this law. Of course, some stores will probably try to ignore the law and sell the pills for much more, but let's assume that the government is somehow successful at enforcing this law in 100% of the stores. Now, customers will start to line up outside the stores for hours and hours before the stores open in order to be the first ones to buy all of the precious aspirin pills. You know, if a store has, for example, 100 pills to sell at 10 cents each, the first person in line might be able to buy all 100 pills delivered that day for $10 and then resell those pills on the black market to people who are desperate for aspirin pills for $100,000. If people on the black market are still paying $1,000 a pill because that's how much they're willing to pay, right? And by the time, they might have stood in line at the supermarket as well, but maybe they were a little farther back in line. By the time they got up to the counter, there were no more aspirin pills on the shelf. They were gone. They were bought up, by the very first person into the store who knew that this first person knew that they were getting a good deal, when the store is being forced to sell the pills at 10 cents a pill, when in reality there are people out there willing to pay 10,000 times that amount. Let's even assume that the government somehow catches every person attempting to resell the pills on the black market. There's still a problem because whoever shows up first in line gets to buy all of the pills for only $10. And who knows, maybe the pills will be even more expensive a year from now. So instead of reselling the pills, maybe that first buyer in line simply hoards all of the pills for a rainy day when he or she might need them. So before the price controls, the very scarce supply of aspirin pills was being rationed according to who could buy them, who had enough money to afford them. After the price controls, the scarce supply of aspirin pills start to be rationed according to who shows up in line the earliest to buy them. At this point, you can imagine that lawmakers would get the idea to issue everyone a ration card, allowing every person to buy maybe one aspirin pill per week for 10 cents. Seems fair, right? Well, even if the government is able to force stores to obey the ration cards and these price controls and prevent either the pills or the ration cards from being sold on the black market, there's still the problem that people now have to make do with such a small and dwindling supply of pills. Because the problem now is that with the pills being sold so cheaply, perhaps just barely above the cost of producing them, there's no particularly strong profit incentive for anyone to invest money in rebuilding the old aspirin factories. That said, the government could spend taxpayer money to rebuild the aspirin factories, and not necessarily to sell the aspirin at a huge profit, but instead to continue to sell the pills at cost. In fact, the government could decide to sell the pills at below cost, in which case consumers would be paying for the aspirin pills mostly when they paid their taxes instead of when they took the pills home from the store. But that's socialism, and we can't have that, right? So let's ignore that for the moment. So what's the alternative? The alternative that was proposed by Adam Smith was to forget about the price controls and forget about the rationing from the start. Instead, let the aspirin pill prices remain at $1,000 per pill for a while. Yes, for a while, only the very wealthy will be able to afford to take aspirin. But investors will notice that aspirin pills are selling for many times their cost of production. Many investors will rush to rebuild the old aspirin factories in order to sell some of that high-priced aspirin. And what this will do is increase the supply of the aspirin and drive the price down because there'll be more for sale and just as many buyers before. So the price will come down until aspirin is selling so cheaply again that there is no exceptional profit in building another new aspirin factory. right? So in this way, profit is Adam Smith's invisible hand that tells investors what society should produce more of in order to satisfy the desires of those who have money. So those things that are making an above average rate of profit, investment will flood into those industries and produce more of those things. Things that are making a below average rate of profit, businesses will go bankrupt and investors will leave those lines of business. And the supply will decrease in those sectors, which is good because businesses were already having a hard time selling. It wasn't profitable for a lot of them to be selling those things. But without any of the businesses coordinating with each other, the profit motive will incentivize some businesses to leave that sector and go to a different sector where there are above average profit rates to be made. And those above average profit rates are a signal that there's a shortage of those goods. Society needs more of them, right? But here are some ways in which relying on the invisible hand might lead to undesired outcomes. First possible objection is that the less money you have, the less say you have in what society produces. For example, if you want a drug to treat your rare form of cancer, but you only have $1 to your name, and a wealthy person with $1 million wants a pizza covered in literal gold, and yes, there are fancy restaurants that make these, which is silly because you can't even eat the gold flakes that they put on the pizza. So it's just a status symbol to say that you bought a pizza with literal gold on it. If this is the situation, then society is going to produce a pizza covered in literal gold long before society produces your cancer drug. Although some people might intuitively find it immoral to prioritize the rich person's desire for gold pizza over the poor person's desire for a life-saving drug, some other people might consider this as a feature rather than a bug of the invisible hand. The idea is that the looming fear of being a poor person in this position will encourage people to work hard to make sure that they get more of a vote on what society will produce for them. Whereas if society always bails out the poor person and pays for their cancer drug, then there is less incentive to not be poor, and people will presumably be lazier. That's how a free market economist might, if they're a real diehard free market economist, that's how they might respond to that. What if investors don't realize that aspirin is selling for many times its cost of production? In cases where individuals have imperfect information about the prices of goods and services in the economy, the invisible hand might not guide people to produce what is most profitable, and consumers might not end up buying the products that will bring them the most satisfaction if product information is misleading or incomplete. So ideally, you really need what economists call perfect information to make the invisible hand work at its optimum level. You need everyone to be aware of every price of every commodity, to be fully informed, which obviously we don't really approximate that situation. Excuse me. What if, number 3 here, what if it takes time for investors to notice that aspirin is selling for many times its cost of production? For example, often in wartime, like in World War I and World War II, the U.S. government didn't feel like it had the luxury of waiting for several years for investors to decide on, I don't know, is it more profitable to build battleships or to make gold pizzas? In those situations, governments kind of suddenly ditch these free market principles and say, look, just build us some battleships now. Suddenly when it becomes really important to produce something, no one seems to have very much practical faith that the invisible hand will take care of it in a timely manner. Fourth possible objection to this free market economics is, what if there's imperfect competition or a large degree of monopoly or concentration of ownership of an industry? For example, if there is just one investor in the entire aspirin industry who faces no potential competition, whether because of patents or regulations or huge fixed costs up front that practically prevent competitors from getting set up, then that investor is under no pressure to lower the price of aspirin pills back down once again after the aspirin factories have been rebuilt. Because who else is going to offer a lower price? Nobody. Number five, perhaps one of the biggest problems potentially with this laissez-faire or free market economics is that there seem to be these baffling yet recurring instances when the invisible hand seems to tell everyone to just stop working. Periods like the Great Depression, which we'll look at later on in this course. These periods when every good or service at the same time becomes unprofitable to produce, which economists call a general glut or a crisis of overproduction. It's as if no consumers wanted anything to be produced for their enjoyment at all, even though if you ask these people, they would tell you that they would definitely like all sorts of things to be produced, but that they just don't have the money to buy those things. So it appears to investors in the free market as if consumers don't really want those things. And why don't people have the money to buy those things? Why? Because they lost their jobs. And why did they lose their jobs? Because nobody seemed to want to buy anything. And around in the circle we go, where the cycle just reinforces itself. So in order to avoid this baffling calamity, we often sit around worrying what the economy will do, as if it's some mysterious demonic spirit that's completely out of humanity's control, rather being something that's a product of our actions, something that we might be able to rationally understand and improve. But free market economists will say it's hubris, it's arrogant overconfidence to think that you could ever understand how the economy functions and improve upon the invisible hand. So what if it causes 25% unemployment, in occasional depressions? You wouldn't be able to do any better if you and a bunch of other people were trying to plan the economy. That remains point of controversy, I suppose. It remains to be seen, but that's the view of the free market economists. So these free market economists were okay with the Gilded Age's concentration of wealth because they said, look, it's inevitable. If that's what the market dictates as the most efficient, then that's the way it's got to be. We shouldn't try to change this. On the other hand, you did have people like Andrew Carnegie who were not totally comfortable with the concentration of wealth in the Gilded Age. He wrote an article called The Gospel of Wealth, where he explained his vision, where basically he and other philanthropists like him thought that the economy could mostly be left to regulate itself, except for the fact that wealth did seem to accumulate in a few hands. And not only was this a problem because it threatened to limit competition and impair the workings of the invisible hand, because the invisible hand depends on competition to drive people to compete and find the most efficient way to do something, the lowest cost method. Not only does it threaten that, but it also threatened to turn the harmonious relations between the rich and the poor into a relationship of explosive hatred. So in order to prevent rage against the rich from reaching a boiling point, as it seemed to be doing at times in the Gilded Age, And in order to uplift the health, morals, and intellect of the working class, Carnegie encouraged other wealthy men like him to preemptively donate some of their wealth to charity, lest all of it be taken away later in a revolution. That would be the worst case scenario. So better to give up some of it now and kind of smooth things over with the working class. You might ask, if Carnegie thought it was proper to give back to working people, why wouldn't Carnegie simply pay his own workers higher wages? Use that money, pay that money back in the form of higher wages rather than in charity. Well, Carnegie believed that for wealthy people like him, their wealth was a testament to their superior wisdom, intellect, and habits. And Carnegie thought that he would know how to help workers better than they would know how to help themselves. There was a widespread stereotype at the time that workers would probably just waste all of their wages on alcohol at the tavern if they got paid any higher wages. So what's the point? So instead, Carnegie kept the profits to disperse as he saw fit, such as by building public libraries. We actually have a public library here in town, the Carnegie Midtown Library up on Central Street. You'll be reading some of Andrew Carnegie's original thoughts on the matter in your discussion forum for this week. Another approach to the inequality of the Gilded Age was the social gospel movement. The social gospel was a reform movement among mainly Protestant Christians in the United States. This reform movement did not want to drastically change how the economy functioned, but they did want to uplift and reform the poor with charity and moral teachings. The most well-known and longest-lasting organization from the social gospel movement is probably the Salvation Army, which is still around. The social gospel movement sometimes blamed capitalism or the rich for problems like poverty, homelessness, alcoholism, crime, prostitution, and pollution. However, the social gospel movement never seriously proposed to get rid of capitalism or the rich. Instead, their proposed solution was to demand that the rich be less greedy and more charitable and virtuous. And the social gospel movement also proposed that the poor would fix many of their problems if only they were more virtuous as well. In this way, the social gospel movement and Andrew Carnegie's gospel of wealth proposed similar solutions to society's problems at the time. The main difference was Andrew Carnegie was motivated by practical concerns about the explosive resentment building between the rich and the poor, whereas the social gospel movement thought that the rich needed to be more charitable simply because it was the ethical and Christian thing to do. Some segments of the social gospel movement also tried to uplift Indians on reservations with charity and education, but often this charity came with strings attached, such as the obligation to listen to sermons and assimilate into Christian culture. Some of the Indians and poor who received this sort of charity sometimes resented the sort of charity that came mixed with strict moralizing and social control. So it wasn't everyone's favorite sort of thing. But a lot of people were genuinely thankful for the charity they got, for sure. In some ways, the philosophy of social Darwinism was a response to social gospel and to people like Andrew Carnegie. Social Darwinism was a response to those people who accepted the fundamentals of free market competition, but who thought that it was both prudent and moral to offer charity and consolation prizes to the losers of that competition. The poor, the people who can't make it for whatever reason and make a living. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer thought that individuals' success or failure in life in a modern society like the United States had little to do with luck or inequality of opportunity. The social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer took it as a given that everyone in a free country like the United States had basically the same equal opportunities to succeed in life. Therefore, there must be something fundamentally wrong perhaps even genetically wrong, with those individuals who failed to support themselves. The social Darwinists predicted that if society gave charity to those who apparently could not succeed in the free market well enough to support themselves, then those inferior people would go on to reproduce and have children and fill the world with even more inferior and parasitic individuals, much as the modern film Idiocracy suggests, if anyone's seen that film. The message at the beginning of that film is very much a social Darwinist message. If this happened, then society would have to devote even more charity to those who were inferior, and the parasitic burden would grow and grow as they had more and more inferior children who could not support themselves. The social Darwinists argued that while it might seem cruel in the short run, humanity as a whole would be smarter, healthier, and more capable later on if only the fittest were allowed to survive and reproduce, and if all the inferior people were allowed to die off, or at least not reproduce. And how do we figure out who is inferior? Simple, said the social Darwinists. Just look at who is too poor to support themselves. So not only was social Darwinism the ultimate justification for unregulated free market capitalism, but it also foreshadowed the eugenics movement and Nazi Germany in a way. Although one difference between the social Darwinist and Nazi German ideology is that social Darwinism saw life as a struggle for the survival of the fittest between every single individual, whereas the Nazi Germans saw life as a struggle for the survival of the fittest between each race. So Nazi Germans thought that Germans were inherently superior individuals. So, for example, if a German happened to be poor, it was probably not due to his own incapability, but only because this honest, hard-working German had somehow been unfairly cheated by these supposedly inherently sickly yet cleverly parasitic Jews. This was what the Nazi Germans thought. Consequently, Nazi Germans did not mind a little bit of charity to uplift members of their own race as long as it made Team Germany stronger in its battle to the death against the other races. So a little bit different from social Darwinism, but similar kind of idea. Another reaction to Gilded Age inequality was reformist labor unionism. And by reformist labor unionism, we mean labor unions that were focused solely on reforms, not on revolution. So the most notable reformist labor union was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, now part of the AFL-CIO, which is still around. And reformist labor unions like this did not like the inequality of the Gilded Age, but neither did they have any big, ambitious plans for getting rid of that inequality. Their demands, in the words of AFL leader Samuel Gompers, was simply more. He said, for example, a quote of his is, he says, "What does labor want? We want more schoolhouses and less jails, more books and less arsenals, more learning and less vice, more leisure and less greed, more justice and less revenge. In fact, more of the opportunities to cultivate our better natures." So the AFL trade unions focused on what they saw as practical, reachable goals. So no dangerous utopian nonsense. Just higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, more. The AFL tried to portray themselves as responsible and reasonable negotiating partners alongside business owners. And the AFL explicitly denounced the radical labor organizations that openly called into question the unequal ownership of businesses. AFL didn't criticize the unequal ownership of business. They just wanted higher wages. Whereas the radical labor unions, like the Industrial Workers of the World, tried to organize all workers of all industries and skill levels and genders and languages, ethnicities, into one big union, which was a difficult task with all the different languages and whatnot. The AFL concentrated on organizing skilled white male workers, and in fact denounced anyone who sought to bring minorities or immigrants into those skilled trades to compete with the existing white male workers for those higher skilled wages. This was popular among the white male skilled workers at the time, and perhaps for all of these reasons, because they focused on this one easy to organize demographic, and because the AFL focused on these practical goals. The AFL became the largest labor union by the year 1900, with over 1 million members in the skilled trades. And it went on to, for a long time, be the largest labor union in the country. There were also radical labor unions, though. The earliest radical labor union was the Knights of Labor, which had a long-run goal of raising money and organizing all workers into worker-owned cooperative businesses so as to eventually end the entire system of workers having to work for others for wages. So they did want to eventually abolish the wage system. However, in the short term, the Knights of Labor also focused on winning higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions, just like the AFL. The Knights of Labor started out strong, but its more radical goals attracted controversy. And in the 1890s, most union workers left the Knights of Labor to join the more practical and respectable AFL unions. The spiritual successor to the Knights of Labor was the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, which was founded in 1905. At its peak, the IWW had roughly 150,000 members, so not a gargantuan number, but it had an influence even bigger than those numbers suggest, due to the IWW's radical goals and fearsome reputation, which you can get a sense of if you watch this short YouTube clip. Like the Knights of Labor, the IWW also sought to abolish the wage system, but unlike the peaceful Knights of Labor, the IWW was willing to use more aggressive tactics. Another response to the inequality of the Gilded Age was socialism. In the late 1800s, socialism did not mean just welfare programs for the poor. It meant more than that. It meant a democratic government that owned nearly all productive assets and that sought to organize nearly all productive activity according to the preferences of its voters. So having a government basically run the entire economy, to be the one main employer, and for the government's priorities and policies to be controlled democratically by voters. That was the plan, at least. The plan of the socialists in America was to organize in political parties, spread their ideas, win elections to offices, and pass the laws and amendments needed to gradually establish democratic state ownership of nearly all businesses. So they tried to do these things legally, peacefully, and gradually, unlike the anarchists, who we'll see here in a second. The Socialist parties also carried out sympathetic actions in support of labor union struggles and other reform movements, such as the women's suffrage movement. So they weren't just narrowly focused on this one thing. They involved themselves in a lot of different movements. The Socialist Party did win some local and state level elections, but they never obtained more than 10% of the vote for president, in the U.S., that is. In Germany, before World War I, their Socialist Party was the largest party in their government. I think more than 30% of the vote. America, less so. I think France was 20% at the time. That said, socialist ideas were still surprisingly influential, despite only getting 10% of the vote for president. A socialist science fiction novel entitled Looking Backward from 2000 to 1877 was, for a period of time, the third most popular book in America, behind Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Hundreds of local fan clubs sprang up around the United States to discuss this book. Looking Backward set out a blueprint for how socialist society should operate. They tried to explain it from this fictional standpoint of a gentleman of Boston who in the book falls into a coma in the year 1877 and somehow miraculously reawakens in the year 2000. Much of the book involves various characters in the year 2000, explaining to this gentleman from the year 1877 how a socialist society worked. And you'll be reading an excerpt from this novel in the discussion forum for this week. The last response towards Gilded Age inequality, number 8 here, is anarchism. There's a lot of misconceptions about anarchism. In the late 1800s, anarchism did not just mean being anti-government. Anarchists of the late 1800s sought to end all hierarchical institutions. To them, this included not just the state, but also organized religion, sexism, and capitalism as well. This quote from American anarchist Emma Goldman's book, Anarchism and Other Essays, in 1910, sums up the views of anarchists of this era, where she says, "Anarchism really stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion, the liberation of the human body from the dominion of property, liberation from the shackles and restraint of government. Anarchism stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purpose of producing real social wealth, an order that will guarantee to every human being free access to the earth and full enjoyment of the necessities of life according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations." And this is a picture of Emma Goldman here. As for how the anarchists were going to create their liberated society without government, without organized religion, without capitalist property, the anarchists' answers seemed too far-fetched to most Americans of the time. Anarchists put a lot of faith in the idea that human beings could naturally cooperate peacefully with each other without rulers or bosses to restrain people's greed and laziness. As anarchists wrote in spray-painted graffiti during a general strike in Paris in May of 1968, I like this quote, kind of sums up the anarchist view. "Man is neither Rousseau's noble savage nor the church's depraved sinner. He is violent when oppressed, gentle when free." So we just need to free people and they'll all get along. Anarchists in the Gilded Age in America might have been tolerated and ignored as a bunch of silly dreamers if those anarchists hadn't been so eager to show just how violent they could be when they felt oppressed. 3 notable examples of this are listed below. First off, we have in 1886 a group of mostly German-American anarchists who were blamed for setting off a bomb that killed 7 police officers who were attempting to break up a labor rally at Haymarket Square in Chicago. 7 anarchists were convicted of being accessories to the murders, despite no evidence that any of them had actually helped obtain or set off the bomb. The police never figured out who actually detonated the bomb. These anarchists were essentially convicted for their prior public rhetoric that, according to some people, recklessly instigated the bombing by calling on working men to arm themselves, as seen in one of their posters here, where they say, "Working men, arm yourselves and appear in full force at this mass meeting." And you see the same message reprinted in German, because a lot of the workers in Chicago at the time were German. Some people, such as anarchist Lucy Parsons, felt that the court was trampling over the defendant's right to freedom of speech under the First Amendment by basically convicting them for their words rather than for having any role in the actual bombing itself. You will read more about her viewpoint in the discussion forum this week, which will be interesting. Another instance, a Russian-American anarchist named Alexander Berkman tried to assassinate the chairman of the Carnegie Steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, during a heated strike there that also resulted in gunfights between the striking workers and the company's Pinkerton security guards. Very controversial labor dispute. And then another instance, a Polish-American anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz, I think that's how you pronounce it, even managed to assassinate the President of the United States, William McKinley, in 1901. For these reasons, anarchists gained a reputation in the media as a bunch of crazy-eyed, foreign-born, bomb-throwing lunatics, as portrayed in this newspaper cartoon. So those are the various responses to the inequality of the Gilded Age. I look forward to hearing your reactions to these and your thoughts on which of these responses you most sympathize with, which will be one of the topics we will talk about in our discussion forum for this week. So I will see you then.